All right, we'll be reading today Chapter 3, Section 1 in your American History textbook. It's on page 74. We'll go over the objectives, describe the conflict of the French and Indian War, explain the impact of the French and Indian War on colonists, identify the Sons of Liberty, and summarize the events that led up to the Boston Massacre. This audio lesson is for those of you who would like to listen to this along with your reading. Listen to this. We'll get started. You will have to complete your organizer as we go. So on page 74, An American Story. At first, Pennsylvania colonist John Hughes was delighted when his friend Ben Franklin helped him get the position of stamp tax collector. By September 1765, however, he feared his job might cost him his life. Anti-tax protests had grown so strong that Hughes barricaded himself inside his house to avoid being attacked. He wrote frantically to Franklin in London, "You are now from letter to letter to suppose each may be the last you will receive from your old friend, as the spirit of rebellion is to a high pitch. Madness has got hold of the people. I fancy some lives will be lost before this fire is put out." Just a few years earlier, British soldiers and American colonists had fought side by side in a successful war against France. After the war ended, tensions between Britain and its colonies grew. Britain wanted the colonies to help pay for the war, while the colonists questioned Britain's authority to make them do so. Misunderstanding and distrust slowly turned many colonists against the British, creating situations that would eventually lead to revolution. The French and Indian War. The French and English had been vying for dominance in Europe since the late 1600s, fighting three major wars between 1689 and 1748. Most of the action took place in Europe, but when France and England were at war, their colonies were at war as well. In 1754, a new struggle began, the First Skirmish. In the 1740s, the British and the French both became interested in the Ohio River Valley. By crossing from Lake Ontario to the Ohio River and following the river south of the Mississippi, the French could travel from New France to Louisiana easily. Meanwhile, British fur traders were entering the Ohio region, and British land speculators began eyeing the land to sell to settlers. To block British claims in the region, the French built a chain of forts from Lake Ontario to the Ohio River. The British decided to counter with a fort of their own in western Pennsylvania. Before they could complete it, however, the French seized it and built Fort Bisquens on the site. In an attempt to expel the French, a young Virginian, George Washington, led troops toward the Ohio River in the spring of 1754. After a brief battle with a small French force, Washington retreated to a hastily built stockade, Fort Necessity. A little over a month later, a large French force arrived and forced Washington to surrender. Ownership of the Ohio River Valley was far from settled, however. Within a few years, the conflict would go into a worldwide war involving several European powers. The Albany Conference. Even before the fighting started, the British government anticipated hostilities. It urged the colonists to work together to prepare for war and negotiate an alliance with the Iroquois. The Iroquois controlled western New York, territory the French had passed through to reach the Ohio River. Accordingly, in June 1754, delegates from 7 colonies met with 150 Iroquois leaders at Albany, New York. This meeting, known as the Albany Conference, achieved several things. Although the Iroquois refused an alliance with the British, they did agree to remain neutral. The colonies also agreed that Britain should appoint one supreme commander of all the troops in the colonies. Finally, Benjamin Franklin and others at the conference developed the Albany Plan of Union, which proposed that the colonies unite to form a federal government. Although the colonies rejected the plan, it showed that many colonial leaders had begun to think about joining together for defense. The British triumph. In 1755, the new British commander-in-chief, General Edward Braddock, arrived in Virginia with 1,400 troops. He linked up with 450 local militia troops and appointed Lieutenant Colonel George Washington to serve as his aide. Braddock then headed west, intending to attack Fort Bisquens. The general disregarded warnings about the Native American allies of the French. "These savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia," he told Benjamin Franklin. "Upon the King's regular and disciplined troops, it is impossible they should make any impression." Braddock's comments later came back to haunt him. 7 miles from Fort Bisquens, French and Native American forces ambushed the British. Braddock was shot and later died. His inexperienced soldiers panicked, and only Washington's leadership saved them from disaster. As enemy shots whizzed past him, leaving 4 holes in his hat and clothes, Washington rallied the troops and organized a retreat. The ambush emboldened the Delaware people of western Pennsylvania to begin attacking British settlers in their land. For the next 2 years, the French and Indian War, as it was called, raged along the frontier. In 1756, the fighting between Britain and France spread to Europe, where it became known as the 7 Years' War. Other countries engaged in the fray, and battles were waged around the globe. In North America, the British fleet quickly cut off the flow of supplies and reinforcements from France. The Iroquois, realizing the tide had turned in favor of the British, pressured the Delaware to end their attacks. With their Native American allies giving up, the French found themselves badly outnumbered. In 1759, a British fleet commanded by General James Wolfe sailed to Quebec City in New France. There, the British defeated the French troops of General Louis Joseph Montcalm. The battle cost both Wolfe and Montcalm their lives, but Britain's victory was the war's turning point in North America. Elsewhere in the world, the fighting continued. Spain joined forces with France in 1761, but the British ultimately triumphed. Under the terms of the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France lost all claims to mainland in North America. Ownership of New France and most of Louisiana east of the Mississippi went to Britain. Spain lost Florida but retained Cuba and the Philippines. As compensation for the loss of Florida, the Spanish gained New Orleans and western Louisiana. So, we're talking about objective number 1 here, describe the conflict of the French and Indian War. So it's called the French and Indian War because the British colonies were fighting the French and the Indians, the Delawares, it tells us, in what was then the Old Northwest, Ohio, the Ohio River region. And so that conflict was fought between the British, right, or the militia of the colonies, right, people who lived in America, the colonists, and then they were supported by British armies. They were fighting the French army and Native American warriors. So that happened in the American frontier, and that is your first objective. So go ahead and pause this recording and complete that objective. All right, now we're going to move on to the second objective to explain the impact of the French and Indian War on the colonists. Great Britain's victory in 1763 left the country deeply in debt. It had to pay not only for the cost of the war, but also the cost of governing and defending its new territories. Many British leaders thought that the colonies should share the cost, especially the cost of stationing troops in the colonies. As the British government adopted new policies to solve its financial problems, colonial resentment grew. So we can talk just a little bit right now, the impact. So there was this huge debt caused from the war. And as a result, Britain needed to pay for it. They needed to pay for the war they just fought. And they said, well, why not have the colonists pay their share? Why not have them pay some of this debt? Because they were the ones most directly impacted by it. They were the ones whose, their families were in peril and needed to be saved. So why not have them pay for it? So that's going to be part of your second objective. Explain the impact of the French and Indian War on the colonists. Is that they were going to be asked to pay for some of the debt that had been created. There'll be a little more as we go on here. So the proclamation of 1763. In the spring of 1763, Pontiac, the chief of the Ottawa people, decided to go to war against the British. After uniting several Native American groups, including the Ottawa, Delaware, Shawnee, and Seneca peoples, Pontiac's forces attacked several forts and towns along the frontier before British troops were able to stop them. Pontiac's war did not surprise British officials. They had been expecting trouble since 1758, when reports first indicated that settlers were moving into western Pennsylvania in defiance of the colony's treaties with the region's Native Americans. British officials did not want to bear the cost of another war. Many officials also owned shares in fur trading companies operating in the region, and they knew that a war would disrupt trade. They decided that the best solution was to limit western settlement until new treaties could be negotiated. When the news of Pontiac's raids reached Britain in the summer of 1763, officials hurried to complete their plans. In early October, King George III issued a royal proclamation of 1763. The proclamation drew a line from north to south along the Appalachian Mountains and declared that colonists could not settle any lands west of the line without the British government's permission. This enraged many farmers and land speculators. So there's another thing we can add to the pot, is that they were going to be asked to pay some more taxes, and they also, where they could settle, the land they could settle had been restricted. If you look on page 76 there, everything to the east of that line was what they could settle, nothing past it. Well, a lot of the people on the frontier wanted to keep moving for new land and to start new farms and to hunt and things like that. So they were not okay with that new proclamation of 1763. Customs reform and new taxes. At the same time the Proclamation Act was angering Western farmers, Eastern merchants were objecting to new tax policies. In 1763, George Grenville became a prime minister and the first lord of the Treasury. Grenville had to find a way to reduce British debts and pay for the 10,000 British troops now stationed in North America. Grenville discovered that merchants were smuggling goods into and out of the colonies without paying customs duties, taxes on imports and exports. Grenville pushed for a law allowing smugglers to be tried in a new vice admiralty court in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Unlike colonial courts, where juries often sympathized with smugglers, vice admiralty courts were run by naval officers and had no juries, a violation of the traditional English right to a jury of one's peers. Sending colonists to distant Nova Scotia also violated the right to a speedy and public trial. So they're being taken, colonists, American colonists that have never been to Britain, are being taken to Nova Scotia, which is now in Canada, all right, to be tried for crimes there. That's going to violate several of the rights that they actually have as English citizens. And that's going to anger them as well. Among those tried under the new system was John Hancock of Massachusetts. Hancock had made a fortune in the sugar trade, smuggling molasses from French colonies in the Caribbean. Defending Hancock was a young lawyer named John Adams. Adams argued that the use of vice admiralty courts denied colonists their rights as British citizens. In addition to tightening customs control, Grenville introduced the American Revenue Act of 1764, better known as the Sugar Act. The act changed the tax rates on imports of raw sugar and molasses. It also placed new taxes on silk, wine, coffee, and indigo. Merchants throughout the colonies complained to Parliament that the Sugar Act hurt trade. Many were also furious that the act violated several traditional English rights. Merchants accused of smuggling were presumed guilty unless proven innocent. The act also let officials seize goods without due process or proper court procedures in some circumstances and prevented lawsuits by merchants whose goods had been improperly seized. In many colonial cities, pamphlets circulated demanding the Sugar Act, or condemning the Sugar Act. In one pamphlet, James Otis argued that taxes could be levied to regulate trade, but those designed to raise money were unjust because the colonists had no representatives in Parliament. Otis wrote, "No parts of His Majesty's dominion can be taxed without their consent." His words gave rise to the popular expression, "no taxation without representation." And that is going to be the biggest thing maybe to remember. No taxation without representation. That's going to be a big rallying cry for many of the merchants in the East. We don't mind paying taxes, but we want to have a say in the taxes that we pay. Parliament soon passed another unpopular measure, the Currency Act of 1764. This act banned the use of paper money in the colonies because it tended to lose its value very quickly. Colonial farmers and artisans liked paper money for precisely that reason. They could take out loans and easily repay them later with paper money that was worth less than when they originally borrowed. So explain the impact of the French and Indian War on the colonists. It created a large debt. That debt needed to be paid for with taxes. Oftentimes, well, they didn't, not oftentimes, all the time, they didn't have a representative. They didn't have a say in what those taxes were. All right. They also were not allowed to move further west, and they were being punished more severely for violating the laws than they had been in the past. So that's going to be your second objective. Please go ahead and pause this and get started with that now. All right, we're going to get on to your third objective, identify the Sons of Liberty. The Stamp Act crisis. Although the Sugar Act had begun to generate money for Britain, Grenville did not believe it would cover all the government's expense in America. To raise more money, he persuaded Parliament to pass the Stamp Act in March 1765. The Stamp Act required stamps to be bought and placed on most printed materials, including newspapers, pamphlets, posters, wills, mortgages, deeds, licenses, bonds, and even diplomas, dice and playing cards. Unlike previous taxes, which had always been imposed on trade, the stamp tax was a direct tax, the first Britain had ever placed on the colonists. Parliament then passed one more law. The Quartering Act was intended to make the colonies pay for more of their own defense. The act required colonists to provide barracks for British troops or to pay to house them in taverns, inns, vacant buildings, and barns. It was the Stamp Act, however, that triggered a reaction. Editorials, pamphlets, and speeches poured out against the impending tax. The Virginia House of Burgesses, roused by Patrick Henry's speeches, passed resolutions declaring that Virginians were entitled to the rights of British people and could be taxed only by their own representatives. Newspapers in other colonies reprinted the resolutions, and other assemblies passed similar statements. By the summer of 1765, groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty were organizing in meetings to protest and trying to intimidate stamp distributors. So who are the Sons of Liberty? Well, so we have all these colonists, and they're not happy with the way things are going. They're being taken to trials in faraway places. They're being restricted from where they can move. They're getting taxed without any representation. They're having to house soldiers in their communities, and they're not happy about it. So what do? They organize in groups to protest and resist all of these new British laws. And that's what the Sons of Liberty is. Sons of Liberty was a group of people that were going to resist. They were going to come together, right? They figured they'd be stronger together. Come together and resist and protest and work for, try to get more people convinced that these were bad. All these things were things they shouldn't have to put up with. They were going to resist British government and all these new policies. So go ahead and record that on your organizer. All right, let's go ahead and flip the page over to the Townshend Acts. During the Stamp Act crisis, Britain's financial problems had worsened. Protests in England had forced Parliament to lower property taxes there, yet somehow the government had to pay for its troops in America. In 1767, Charles Townshend, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, introduced new measures to raise money from the colonies. These came to be called the Townshend Acts. One measure, the Revenue Act of 1767, put new customs duties on glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea imported into the colonies. Violators of the Revenue Act could be tried in Vice Admiralty courts, those were those courts that were up in Nova Scotia, where they were presumed guilty and had to prove their innocence. The Townshend Acts, like the Sugar Act, also allowed officials to seize private property under certain circumstances without following due process. To help customs officers arrest smugglers, the Revenue Act legalized the use of writs of assistance. These were general search warrants that enabled customs officers to enter any location during the day to look for evidence of smuggling. Writs had been used before, but in 1760, James Otis has challenged them in court. The issue remained unresolved until the Revenue Act of 1767 declared writs of assistance to be legal. Action and reaction. The Townshend Acts infuriated many colonists. During the winter of 1767 to 1768, John Dickinson publishes letters from a Pennsylvania farmer in colonial newspapers. In these essays, Dickinson reasserted that only assemblies elected by the colonists had the right to tax them. In addition, he called on the colonies to become firmly bound together to form one body politic to resist the Townshend Acts. So just to review there real quick. So again, they're looking for he is saying that only if they have representatives in their legislature, that's the only way they should be able to have new taxes, because then they have a say in them. But right now, they don't have anybody at bat for them. They don't have anybody in Congress or in Parliament, I should say, working for them to try to pass taxes that they like. So that's what he's talking about in those letters. Less than a month after Dickinson's first letter appeared, the Massachusetts Assembly began organizing against Britain. Among the leaders of this resistance was Sam Adams of Massachusetts, cousin of John Adams. In February 1768, Sam Adams, with the help of James Otis, drafted a circular letter for the Massachusetts Assembly to pass and circulate to other colonies. The letter expressed opposition to the Townshend Acts, and British officials ordered the Massachusetts Assembly to withdraw it. When the Assembly refused, the British government ordered the body dissolved. In August 1768, the merchants of Boston and New York responded by signing the non-importation agreements. Philadelphia's merchants joined the boycott in March 1769. In May 1769, Virginia House of Burgesses passed the Virginia Resolves, which stated that only the House could tax Virginians. When Britain ordered the House dissolved, its leaders, including George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson, immediately called the members to a convention. This convention then passed a non-importation law that blocked the sale of British goods in Virginia. As the boycott spread, the colonists again stopped drinking British tea and buying British cloth. Women's groups, known as the Daughters of Liberty, began spinning their own rough cloth called homespun. Wearing homespun rather than British cloth became a sign of patriotism. Throughout the colonies, the Sons of Liberty encouraged people to support the boycotts. In 1769, colonial imports from Britain declined sharply from what they had been in 1768. So we not only got the Sons of Liberty, but we got the Daughters of Liberty actively defying these laws that the British are passing. At the Boston Massacre. In the fall of 1768, as violence against customs officers and British in Boston increased, Britain dispatched roughly 1,000 soldiers to the city to maintain order. So let's pause real quick. So there's all this stuff boiling up, all this hate and discontentment. And in Boston particularly, it gets particularly heated. Britain sends in the army to kind of cool things off a little bit. Bostonians heckled and harassed these troops, referring to them as lobsterbacks because of the red coats they wore. On March 5, 1770, a crowd of colonists began taunting and throwing snowballs at a British soldier guarding the customs house. So pause again. We got all of these people, right? It's heated. People are angry. And we got all these soldiers, and people are harassing them, they're heckling them, they're yelling at them, they're throwing snowballs at them. It's probably pretty close, we're not, there's that proximity thing where it's probably a really tense situation. His call for help, we're talking back about British soldiers, brought Captain Thomas Preston and a squad of soldiers. Preston described what happened next. The mob still increased and were outrageous, striking their clubs and bludgeons against one another and calling out, "Come on, you rascals, you bloodybacks, you lobster scoundrels, fire if you dare. We know you not dare, or we know you dare not." They advanced to the point of the bayonets, struck some of them in even the muzzles of the pieces, and seemed to be endeavoring to fight with the soldiers. So think about what that scene's like. These guys, these soldiers have showed up. They got their guns. They got their bayonets, which is that long knife on the end of the gun. And the people are so close that they're actually hitting the bayonets. And they're shouting at them, and they're daring them to shoot them. In the midst of the tumult, one soldier was knocked down. He rose angrily and fired his weapon into the crowd. This triggered a volley of shots from the rest of the troops, who thought they were under attack. When the smoke cleared, 3 colonists lay dead, 2 more would die later, and 6 more were wounded. According to accounts, the first person to die was a part African, part Native American man known as both Michael Johnson and Crispus Attucks. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre. Colonial newspapers portrayed the British as tyrants who were willing to kill people who stood up for their rights. Further violence might have ensued, but had not news arrived a few weeks later that the British had repealed almost all of the Townshend Acts. Parliament kept one tax, on tea, to uphold its right to tax the colonies. At the same time, it allowed the colonial assemblies to resume meeting. Peace and stability returned to the colonies, but only temporarily. So the Boston Massacre, right? We have these colonists, we have these soldiers. They're in a really tense situation. Soldier gets knocked down, gets up, shoots, and then they kill. They end up killing 5. 5 colonists eventually die, 6 wounded. And what the colonists do is they're going to use this to fuel this hatred against the British, because now they're shooting us, right? They're not just taxing us and taking away our rights. They're actually shooting us. And this is going to be something that's going to really stick in the minds of a lot of people. The government's going to try to diffuse things by repealing almost all of the acts and all of the taxes. but the tea tax is going to stay, right? So that's what the Boston Massacre is. Now, how did we get to that point where the government was shooting at its people? Well, let's back up, all right? Started with the French and Indian War. Government needed to collect some more money, and they did so, right? But they did it without the consent of the people in the colonies. Well, the people were angry about that. And what did the government do? The government seemed to amp up its response a little bit, begin taking people to Nova Scotia for trials, begin taking away the right to have due process, treat them as guilty before they can prove themselves as innocent, right? So what did that do? Well, that amped up the colonists' anger and resentment and hatred, and they formed these groups to start kind of organizing against the government. Well, the government's not going to like that, so they pass more laws to say that we have the right to tax you, and then that's going to, on the other side, the colonists are going to get more angry because no, you don't have the right to tax us without our consent. We need to have people who are batting for us in Parliament if we're going to pay these taxes. So what we can see here is on both sides, it's kind of one side ups the ante a little bit, and then the other side matches it. And then the one side ups it, and the other side has to match it. So it's kind of this escalating situation, and we get to a point from a tax to pay for a war turning into the Boston Massacre because neither side's really willing to back down from the other. So go ahead and fill that out on your organizer and complete the critical thinking.